Hi everyone. Here's my introduction to qualitative research lecture. I figured that I'd record it ahead of time and you could watch it at your convenience. And then we can use our synchronous time together for something more interactive. So if you have questions or stuff comes up as you're watching this, please make a note of it because we'll have a chance to discuss pretty soon. Okay, so this video should take about a half an hour. It's aimed at a very introductory level for those who haven't encountered qualitative research much before. So if you are familiar with qualitative research, it'll be a bit of a refresher. I'm going to start by talking about what the point of qualitative research is, why you might, be interested to learn more, and then talk in a little bit more detail about what exactly qualitative research is, what kind of analytic logic it uses, and I'll introduce the idea of a toolkit for qualitative research, which is something that we'll come back to when we meet in person or virtually. So what's the point of qualitative research? Well, qualitative research holds different assumptions and uses different methods to answer different types of questions than quantitative research. So sometimes people who aren't very familiar with qualitative research tend to think of it as, is this better than quantitative? Is it worse? But it's really just different. It's useful for answering different types of questions. So you might find that qualitative research is helpful if your research question is about something that can't be measured. For instance, if you're interested in the opinions, the experiences, or the beliefs of participants. Qualitative research can be useful if you're not sure exactly what information you need to answer the question. For instance, what factors are important to come up with an answer. Or if the boundaries and the parameters of the question are still broad and they might just need a little bit more exploration within the data collection process itself. So here are some examples of the type of questions that qualitative research can answer. Why don't patients take their medications as prescribed? How do physicians develop good clinical judgment? Or what effects does a particular policy have on the clinical experience of patients? Qualitative research is also helpful for explaining unexpected findings. So here's two examples of studies that I've been involved in recently. In the first study, we conducted a prospective cohort to try to figure out what psychological, physical, and social features predict excess gestational weight gain. We found a whole list of different features that impact or predict rather excess gestational weight gain, including being overweight before pregnancy, this being the first child, eating in front of a screen, planning to gain in excess, having low self-efficacy regarding their ability to control pregnancy weight gain, being agreeable, and having emotional control difficulties. So in our follow-up qualitative study, we asked why and how each of these factors matter, what modulates them, how are they related or not related. So in the quantitative study, in the prospective cohort, we really were just able to identify what some of the predictors are, but we couldn't understand necessarily why they were predictors, so it would be hard to come up with an intervention or some way to try to change some of these predictors. And so our qualitative study let us do that. I'll give you an example of one of the things we found through the qualitative study. The predictor of planning to gain weight in excess of the guidelines was predictive of actually gaining weight in excess of the guidelines, which seems intuitive and seems like it would be pretty easy to intervene on by saying, don't plan to gain in excess. But we found in our qualitative study we interviewed about 40 pregnant women, that they often didn't know they were planning to gain in excess, but rather it was a misunderstanding about what their target weight was based on their pre-pregnancy weight. So sometimes they would have the right target weight, but they would be putting it to the wrong pre-pregnancy weight, which changes what your target should be. And so these people weren't actually planning to gain in excess, they were just planning to gain the wrong amount. And understanding that information about the quantitative predictor gives a very specific intervention about this potential predictive factor, making sure that each pregnant person understands what their target weight is in relation to what their pre-pregnancy weight is. All right, continuing. Qualitative research can also help identify factors of interest for further study or for further intervention. So I was involved in a study a few years ago where the problem was that people who have type 2 diabetes had really low levels of medication adherence. And so we conducted a qualitative study about how patients with type 2 diabetes manage their medications and what were the barriers and the facilitators they could experience. From that information, you could, and we didn't do this, but one could design an intervention that was designed to alleviate the particular barriers that were identified. And then go on and further study the prevalence of those particular barriers, the effectiveness of the intervention, all kinds of other future research that could come later, both quantitative and qualitative. The acceptability of the intervention, perhaps. Okay, so qualitative and quantitative in comparison. So there's some common distinctions. Usually when we talk about qualitative research, we're talking about research that's descriptive or interpretive, that uses inductive analytic logic, that looks for meaning, that's interested in producing research which is deep and which is unique, that might hold the existence of multiple realities, that looks at phenomenon in a holistic way, aims to develop theory, is process-oriented, and tries to produce rich descriptions. All of these on the other side are matched with the typical quantitative description. So instead of description and interpretation, quantitative research aims for explanation. Instead of using inductive analytic logic, it uses deductive analytic logic, and so on. So this idea about qualitative research, one of the trademarks or the hallmarks of it is that it uses an inductive approach. And like everything else in research, this is always like a typical, but there are exceptions. So typically it uses an inductive approach and emphasizes the ways in which individuals interpret their social world. It's interested in gathering participant descriptions and understandings of human behavior, and it strives for careful and detailed descriptions or interpretations of social practices to understand how participants experience and explain their own world. So the reasoning here is one of induction or exploration, looking to participants to identify what's important to them rather than imposing the assumptions of the researcher. This requires open research questions and open interview questions. So I'll give you an example. If you are conducting a quantitative study, you have to decide what you're going to measure, what your variables are, what's important, how you're going to collect that data before you start the research project. In a qualitative research study, you don't need to identify what's important to the criteria. This is what you're asking your participants. You know, what's important to you about your experience of this? What was influential or what was impactful about your experience of that? So that's why we call it more exploratory. And then I have a little note down here that it starts with induction, but there's sort of this shift to deductive reasoning later on in analysis. There are some types of qualitative research that do start in a more deductive mode. And I'll talk in a couple of minutes about induction and deduction because it's a very important concept in research in general and might not be something that you've encountered very recently, perhaps. Okay, sorry for the color of the text here. So this is a diagram that shows the difference between inductive and deductive reasoning. Along the bottom, it says data, specific data, and then the circle at the top says a general theory. Inductive reasoning goes from your specific data to a general theory. Deductive reasoning starts with that general theory and then looks to apply it to specific data. So in qualitative research, why do we go from the particular to the general? So I think that this is a key concept to understand here. That sometimes when you start with the general, when you start with the bird's eye view, you don't see exactly the same type of things when you start with the particulars. You're coming in informed by your assumptions, informed by the literature, informed by your personal experiences, and that sometimes gets in the way of understanding somebody else's experience or something that you're not yet aware of. By starting inductively, by starting with the specific examples that come from your data, you can really pay attention and see things that you might not have seen before. So the metaphor here of a handful of sand, you might see different types of silica or different compositions of the sand that you wouldn't necessarily think of if you were looking at the whole desert. You'd be looking here at you know, the dunes and the wind patterns and the trees, and you're focusing on different things. So here's an example of how inductive logic works. So the metaphor would be how to categorize these buttons. If I gave you a jar full of buttons and I told you to organize them, you probably would start with your preconceived categories about what's in there. You might organize them by color, you might organize them by number of holes. But if you start by describing what's there, by looking at each button individually and making a list of descriptors, such as I've listed here, you start to see different things. You start to pay attention to what's in the data and form different categories based on that, rather than coming in with your preconceived notions. So sure, colors here, number of holes are here, but there's also some other things that I didn't think of when I just looked at the big collection of buttons. I didn't think of the opacity. I didn't think about shininess or matte. I didn't think about the patterns that were present. I didn't think about the sort of the saucer lip ridge aspect of it. All of these things are only available to me, or they only occur to me as an analyst when I look at the particulars. So anyways, then I might start grouping them like this, and go back to my big pile of buttons and say, okay, I've decided that it's going to be useful to sort by the type of shininess versus mattness. So then I'm going to sort it like that. That's kind of how the logic of induction works with data. You look at the data in little small pieces, you think about what's important, then you go back to the rest of the data and apply that category. Once you do this a few times, then you start to group those categories together. But now we're getting into a level of detail that's not necessary for this very introductory talk. So what goes into a qualitative research project? I think this is one of the basic or sort of foundational things that will help you think about designing and thinking about appraising or reading or evaluating qualitative research. So there's a number of essential components that will vary, the essential components will always be present, but they'll vary depending on what the project is. And these include the worldview, the research approach, and the data collection strategy. Sometimes when people talk about qualitative research, they talk about an interview study or a focus group study, but this should be the last thing that you choose, not the first thing. So when you're building a project, there do exist some prepackaged sets of worldviews or paradigms and methodology and methods. And as a novice researcher, it's really helpful to take one of those prepackaged sets, because then you don't have to figure out the details of all of the available options and think about how to put them together in a congruent way. Someone has already kind of done that for you. Now, it is acceptable to mix and match your methodology, your methods, your paradigm, but it has to be justified. And some techniques are used together more frequently, and some are in philosophical opposition. So there's some flexibility here with how you might combine these different aspects, but there's also some ways that would be wrong or not rigorous to use together. So here we can use an example of, if you want to install a screw, you could use a screwdriver, or you could use a drill. There's sort of like a bit of mixing and matching, but you can't use a hammer. Those two things are just, they're in opposition. They're not going to work together. And if you go to someone and you say, this is how I'm going to build my chicken coop or whatever you're building, I'm going to use this hammer, I'm going to use this screw, they know that what you're going to produce is not going to be good, and they probably won't give you money or be very interested in publishing the thing that you've made using these tools that are in opposition. You also want to choose your methods to match broader research considerations. So lots of times I have people who don't really have much experience with qualitative research come to me and say, okay, I want to study this, let's do a focus group study. But the methods should be the last thing that you choose, not the first. It's kind of like saying, let's use a wrench. Like, there's so many different focus groups, ways that you could conduct a focus group, ways you could analyze a focus group, combine it with other things, that it's just not very meaningful to start with that. There's more important things to start with, more helpful things to start with. Usually I start with the worldview and then move to methodology, and then method would be the final thing. So when I talk about worldview, this is a concept that lots of people discuss, but using different words. So you might have heard someone talk about a paradigm or an epistemological paradigm or a theoretical tradition. Basically, it's the philosophy that underlies the science that you're creating. It usually consists of some knowledge about ontology, or what exists, epistemology, what can be known, and methodology, how we can know it. And it's the foundation of all research, not just qualitative. It is present in quantitative research too, although because there are fewer options, you're kind of in the positivist or the post-positivist paradigms when you're conducting quantitative research, people tend not to think about it as much because it's kind of a given. In qualitative research, there's more options, so it's something that's worth considering explicitly. If these words are not making sense to you and you've never heard these concepts before, you might investigate some future reading or resources. If you're really starting at an introductory level, I would open up that Grix 2002 paper, Introducing Students to the Generic Terminology of Social Research. It's a very nice introduction to this concept. When you have a bit of a handle on what epistemology and what ontology means, you can go to the other two papers, which will talk about how to use those in qualitative research. All right, methodology. So methodology is a package of guidelines for conducting qualitative research. They tend to be affiliated with particular worldviews. They come with data collection guidelines, they come with guidelines for doing sampling, they come with guidelines for doing analysis. Each one of them has developed out of different disciplines, evolved in different ways, has a different focus, and so they're sort of all under the larger umbrella of qualitative research, but they really have very different flavors to them. So how do you choose a methodology? So I think that first thing to do is to familiarize yourself with a few different methodologies and look for one that asks the type of question that you're interested in asking. And sometimes you might end up refining your research question a bit after choosing a methodology because these two things kind of develop in sequence. Now, they might take away my professor card for this last bullet point, but Wikipedia is a pretty great place to start because it will have a short summary of what each of the methodology is about and then a list of key texts that you could go to learn more. So then instead of having to read like an entire book or even a whole journal article, you can find like 500 words about what is this, and then some authoritative sources that you could go to learn more. So methods, those are the last things. These are the tools typically for data collection, although they're often paired with tools for data analysis in the same way. And there's lots of different options here. So there's interviews, which you're likely familiar with, and those can look all kinds of different ways. They can be unstructured, semi-structured, they can be narrative interviews focused on eliciting stories, all kinds of different stuff. Focus groups, which would be kind of like a group interview where you're interested in the conversation or the interaction between participants. You can observe people either participating in what they're doing or not. Lots of different ways of collecting and analyzing texts, and also lots of different art approaches, photo voice, mind mapping, rich pictures, all kinds of stuff, all kinds of ways of collecting data that's more artistic. So your qualitative research toolkit contains each of these three things, worldview, methodology, and methods, but there's lots of different options within each of these categories to construct the tools that you need for the particular project that you have in front of you. Often people want to know, what do you choose first? And there's not a clear right answer to this. But a potential starting point is to consider the question that you want to ask. So your research question, you can think about the type of data that's accessible. You could think about methodologies that you might already be comfortable with, that you might already know. You can think about theories that you're aware of and what methodologies they might fit with, the way you see the world, the way you think about the concept that you're investigating. And then there's sort of some iteration usually between how you're constructing your project and what you already know, what you're already familiar with, what you're already comfortable with. So for example, I do a lot of grounded theory research because it's just a methodology that I'm very comfortable with. And so I tend to now think of my research questions in terms of grounded theory questions. A little template for designing a qualitative research project. I think these are things that you need to think about in every research project. They're things you can think about when you read a qualitative research project about whether the authors have given you enough information to evaluate how they conducted each of these aspects. And this aligns, there's a lot of, or not a lot, there's a number of different reporting criteria for qualitative research, and this list aligns with the common aspects of those. But all of these elements must work together, and that's really the key in designing or in appraising a qualitative research project is how the different pieces fit together in a congruent way. So that's it for this introduction. If you have questions or topics you'd like me to cover in more detail when we meet in person, I would be very happy to hear that. And if not, I'll come up with some topics myself and we will meet for discussion on Wednesday.